Now we want to add the login, registration, and user functionality in our existing project. For that, the .NET team has provided a solution, which is scaffolding identity in .NET Core project. If you read through the documents, there will be few changes that are needed, and we will have to make all of them inside our project. So let me walk you through all the changes that we have to do. We will go back to the application and stop the application, close all the tabs. Then in order to scaffold identity, we will be working with the App&WEB project. On this project, if we right-click, Add, we have New Scaffolded Item. In there, we have Identity, and here we have the Identity Razor class library. If you try to add this here, it will do some scaffolding and then it will display options. So you can see we have many options that are available when we scaffold the identity. We have all of the files or pages that the .NET Core team has provided. We can override all of these files so that we can modify them when needed. Here, if you want a different master page for the identity pages, you can explicitly define that. But we want to use the default underscore layout, so we will leave that as blank. When we work with user like registration, login, we will have to store that user details in database tables. For that, we will need a data context. If there is any existing data context, it should be displayed in the drop-down here. Now you might think that we already have application DB context that we are already using for our database. So it makes sense to reuse that DB context. In order to do that, we will have to make one change. Let me close the scaffolding here. We will go to our application DB context. When we want to use a DB context with identity class library, it should not implement the DB context. It should implement something known as identity DB context. If you do Control dot here, it will show you the new package that you have to install, which is Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity.Entity Framework Core. We will find and install the latest version. Once you do that, if you go back and try to scaffold identity, this time it will display that option. Let me show that. If you click the drop down here, now you see application DB context is coming up. Let's select that, override all the files, and we do not need any user class. Let's hit the add button. This will take a while. It will build your project. If there are any errors, this will fail. We have to install the following package, Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Identity.UI. Let's do that. Right here, manage NuGet packages. We will search for identity.ui, and that is already installed. Let's try scaffolding one more time here. Sometimes the errors are weird when you're scaffolding, so we will try that once again. There was a bug in preview 7 of .NET 6 where scaffolding was not working at all, and Microsoft fixed that with RC1 of .NET 6. This time we see a different error message which says the specified Bootstrap version 4 is not valid. The valid options are 3, 4, and 5. Let's click OK here, and let me close the scaffolding. Now the default Bootstrap that came with the project, we are not using that anymore. There is some issues that are going on with the compatibility, so inside the lib where we have Bootstrap, we can just delete this altogether. So with that, we no longer have that Bootstrap library. But the actual error that was there is inside program.cs. Because what happened here is when we are adding a DB context, it is adding new entries with SQL Server. You can see we already had a DB context with the name of application DB context, When we scaffold identity, it tries to add a new DB context. We do not need that, so make sure to remove that. Then here, if you notice on the services, it added a default identity with identity user and options of sign-in require confirmed account to be true. We do not want that confirmation, so let's remove that as well. Those are the changes that have been done because of the scaffolding. So let's try scaffold one more time and see what happens. Scaffolding identity to an existing project is always tricky, but I wanted to walk you through all the errors and how to resolve them. And perfect! Once we were able to tackle all the error messages, you can see the scaffolding has completed successfully. And again, it added this connection string here, so we need to remove the duplicate DB context because we have the default connection DB context on line 16. Let me save all the changes here, and what else got added? If we scroll down, we have authentication inside our program.cs now. Then if you open Solution Explorer and if you examine all the folders that we have a new folder with the name of Areas. Inside Areas, we have Identity, where we have Pages, and you see lots of new Razor pages. We have Login, Register, Logout, Access Denied, Confirm Email, and much more. These are all the default pages that .NET Core provides with the scaffolded identity. So that is great news. But if you run the application now, you will still see the same project. So here, how do you see the new pages that got added? Let me show that in the next video. But before that, if you scaffold identity and you are running into weird error messages, I want you guys to make sure of one thing here. You have to right click here, manage NuGet packages, and inside the installed tab, all of the versions that you have must be the same version. I am using .NET 6 RC1, so you can see all of them are RC1. If one of the package is Preview 7 or RC2 or some other version, scaffolding will fail and it will give you weird error messages. So make sure to go to all the project and examine the versions that are installed. Like here, one version is .NET 5. I will update that to the RC that I'm using. Even though in my case it completed successfully, you might get an error message if the versions are not same. So make sure that all the versions are same in the NuGet package if you get any different error when you are scaffolding the identity. So that being said, let's customize the new identity that got added from the next video. Now that the identity has been scaffolded in our project, if you examine pages, inside the shared folder, we have a new partial view which is Login Partial. In this partial view, we have links to register and log in if the user is not signed in, and if the user is signed in, we have some other links here. So what we want to do is we want the register and login button inside our master page. So I will open the underscore layout here, and I will call the partial view right before our UL tag ends. So here we will say partial name is equal to underscore login partial. That is exactly what we have. With that in place, let me run the application. And great, right here you see register and login buttons. If you click on them, we have a default view that has been provided. But even if you try to log in or register, this will not work. The reason behind that is we do not have the database tables that are configured for handling all of the identity requests. To do that, if we close the application here, and let's open up the NuGet package manager. You will just have to write the command add migration add identity to DB. If you hit enter, it will automatically scaffold the identity migrations that are needed. Of course, we will have to change the default project to data access Let's do that. And great, you can see a new migration is added. Here it is creating new tables, ASP.NET Roles table, ASP.NET Users table, ASP.NET Role Claims, and much more. All of these tables are related to the identity that we scaffolded. So it's pretty normal stuff. Let's push this to database with the command update database. Once that is done, let's go to our SQL Server. If we refresh the tables here, you can see lots of new tables were added. All of the new tables will start with ASP.NET. So here we have ASP.NET, then role claims, role, user claims, user logins, user roles, user, and user token. ASP.NET Users is the main table that we will be working with. When a user registers, we will get an entry right here. Let me show that. We will switch back to the application and hit the Run button. We will hit the Register button here and let's sign up for an account. I have entered test at .NET Mastery. Let's hit the Register button. You can see something happened, but it stayed on the same page. If we go to ASP.NET Users table, the user has not been created. So something is failing within our register page. Let's examine that. Let me switch back to the application and let me close everything that we have open right here. We will open up the Blazor page that got added. That is inside areas, identity, pages, account, and we have register.cs HTML and .cs. This is the default page that is created. If you examine inside register model, we have so many things. What we want to worry about right now is the post handler that we have. We have input model, that's fine. We have get handler and we have post handler. If I add a debugging point here and try to register once again, you will notice that model state will not be valid. If you see, model state is false. So what exactly is false in model state? If you go to the result view, you will notice that the return URL is not valid. The reason behind that is it is null, and we say that here it will be a string of return URL. Now this was different, but with .NET 6 they have added strict validation. So you just make this field nullable and it will work. Let me keep the breakpoint here and run the application one more time. I have a feeling they will change this in future because this should work by default, but as of right now, we have to make some changes, as you can see. If we hit register now, you will see the model state is now valid. Previously, model state was not this strict. With .NET 6, they have changed that even if we are handling null here, the string here, we will have to explicitly say that this is nullable. Only then the model state is valid. So that is some things that have been changed. But since we are here, let's examine what actually happens when we hit the register button. It first checks if the model state is valid. If it is creating a new user. If we press F12 here, it is just a small method here in which it creates an instance of the default identity user. Pretty straightforward. If we go back, next it sets the username, sets the email, and this is the main method that actually creates the user, and the password that we entered is right here, which is admin123 *. Once the user manager creates the user, we have the result to see if this is successful. So if it is successful, then we want to get the user ID, we are generating an email, and we are sending an email to confirm your email address. All of this is done by default. After that, we are checking if required confirm account is true. If it's not, we will just sign in the user and we will redirect to the home page. Let's do an F5 here, and perfect. It has signed in the new user, and we have the logout button and the user's email address. So we had to make one small change inside the register.cs HTML to allow the nullable string. But in future, if this is fixed, then it should work by default. So with that, our application looks good. Let's continue in the next video. Now the navigation that got added here is too close. I want to add it on the right hand side here. So if we go back to the application, inside the underscore layout, we will cut the partial and we will add that after the UL tag. With that, if we refresh, you can see it is assigned on the right side. Inside the login partial, we have the classes of text dark. We will remove them so the text is little lighter. Let me save that, and this looks much better. Now since our user is created, let's go back to our database and examine the ASP.NET Users table. And here we have an ID that is a grid. Next we have the username and normalized username and email. So you can see username is same as the email address. If we scroll to the right, the email confirmed is false by default. We saw inside register we have code to send the email, but we have no service that is configured to send out emails yet, because of which no emails will be sent right now. We have password that is hashed, and we have some security stamps right here. Next we have a phone number field, phone number confirmed, two-factor enabled, and we have a lockout end. Lockout end date, if this is populated with a future date, that means that the user is locked out until that date. So these are the default fields that are added in the ASP.NET Users table. But in a typical application, these fields are not sufficient. We need more fields when it comes to logging the user information. The most common ones is first name and last name of the user itself. So how can we configure this identity to add more properties? Extending any of the identity tables is pretty simple. For that, let me stop the application and we will have to create a new model. So inside solution, where we have the models, let me create a new model. We want to extend user. Let me call that application user. Now this application user must have all of the properties that we have, but we want to extend this ASP.NET Users table. So for that, it will extend the identity user, that is the default user. When you click that, you will notice we have to install an extension package, which is microsoft.extensions.identity.store. Let's find and install that, and this will be a public class. This identity user is the default user that we have in our application. If you examine the program.cs, where we are adding the default identity, we have identity users. And we are saying here that identity user must implement the application DB context. That is why when we added a migration, a new migration was added for all the identity tables. Even though we did not make any changes in the application DB context, it was automatically adding all of those tables because we registered identity users to use our application DB context. So that is how the binding was done. Now we are saying that application user will extend the identity users, and on top of that, we want to add more properties like, let's say, first name and last name. Now in a real-world application, there might be more fields like address of the user and much more. But we will keep things simple because I want to show you how to extend the identity user. So now we have to replace identity user with application user. But before that, when we extend, we need to add more columns here for first name and last name. To do that, we will have to open up our DB context, which is application DB context, and here we will have to create a DB set for application user. I will call that as application user, and let's add a new migration. I will name this extend identity user. It will build the project. If there are any errors, we will have to fix that first. Perfect, the default project was data access and it added the migration. You can see here the columns that it is adding. It is adding a discriminator column, a new column for first name and last name in the ASP.NET users. Let's update the database. And perfect, that looks good. If we do select star here, it will have the new columns at the very end. The discriminator column is null right now. But I want to show you one more thing here. Let's go back and run the application. Let me log out here and let me register for a new user. I'm just using test1 here and register. Now if we go back to the database and if we execute again, the new user test1 will have the new column discriminator populated as identity user. This discriminator column will distinguish on how the user is created or what is the user type. Because now in our application, we have identity user as well as application user. So this particular user that we just added was an identity user. In future, we will only be using application user, but I wanted to create one to show that. Now the next step that we have to do is everywhere in our application where we have identity user, we want to use application user so that we can add first name and last name when we register a user. Let's configure all of that from the next video. Now that we have application user, we want to use that when a new user registers for an account. We will navigate to App&WEB. Inside the areas, we have the registered UI and the page model. If we scroll down, we have lots of services that we are using with dependency injection. What we want is on the register page, we want to collect two more inputs, one for the first name and last name. So let me copy this email that we have here and paste it two more times. We will not be able to bind that to name or any other property. We will first have to create that inside the bind property that we have, which is input model. So if you scroll down, we should have an input model right here where we have email, password, and confirm password. So right here, let me add three more required properties, which will be first name, last name, and phone number. Once we add these three properties, we will be able to configure them right here. So we have first name now. Let me paste that. We do not want any autocomplete. Let me copy the first name, paste it one more time for the last name. After that, we want the phone number. Let me add that here. And we do not need any autocomplete again. That looks good. Let me save this. So now we are asking user for first name, last name, and phone number. So what will happen is when the post handler will be called once the button is submitted, at that point we want to create an application user and not an identity user. We have a method here which is create user. If you press F12, it scrolls down to its implementation, and here it creates an instance of identity user. We do not want to create an identity user. We want to create an instance of application user, and that will be the return type. So let me scroll up. Now this user is of type application user. We are setting the username and email, and then we are creating the user on line 126 right here. Before we create the user, now we also want to set first name, last name, and phone number. So on user, we will have first name, that we will bind from this input right here. This input is actually the input model where we added more properties. So first name is input.firstname, next we have last name, and finally we have phone number. So we will add those three properties, and this looks good because now the user that will be created will be an application user. With that change, let me run the application and create a new user. Let's go to register here. We will call the email as appuser@.NET Mastery and let's register. So the registration is successful. Let's go to SQL Server and execute select star from ASP.NET User. We have our app user here. If we scroll to the right, you can see the discriminator this time is application user. We have first name, last name, and phone number populated. So perfect. With this, you can see how we can customize the default identity user, and we will be using application user with more properties moving forward. So with that, let's continue from the next video. Now that the application user has been created, in our application, we will have multiple roles. So we need to configure our identity to use the different roles that we can create. If you examine the database, we have some tables for ASP.NET roles, ASP.NET user roles. So how can we configure multiple roles in our website? First thing that I will do for that is I will create constant for all the roles that I want. And that constant will be inside the utility project that we created. Let's add a new class file. I will call this class file st, which stands for static detail. This will be a public static file. That way we do not have to create an object, and I will add 4 constants in there. We have manager role, we have a front desk role, a kitchen role, and a customer role. These are the 4 roles that we will have to create, and any user in our application will belong to one of the following roles. So these are just the constants. That looks good. When we are creating a user, we want to display in a drop-down where someone can select the role they want. So for that, let's go to register here, and we will add radio buttons right here. So I'll give it a div, give it a class of form floating, and let me add margin y of 2 in all of the form floating. That will just give a little bit of more space between the elements. Perfect. In here, I want an input tag of type radio, and let me call this rd user role. We will give it the value that is inside our static detail class file. In order to access that static detail right here, we will have to add a using statement. So after register model, we will say using abby.utility. Now when you write a utility, it is not accessible here. Let's add a project reference. We will be adding the utility project. Once we do that, the error should go away. So when we are adding the using statement for utility value, now we can access the static details. In there, we have manager role. That is the value that we want, and here we will display the same, which is manager role. Let me copy and paste this 2 more times. The next one, I'll make it a kitchen role, and I will have a front desk role. So if none of the radio buttons are selected, we will implement a logic to create user with customer role. So with that in place, let's go to the register.cshtml.cs. Inside here, we need something to work with the role. If you go to the top here, you will notice we have user manager, sign-in manager, user store, but nothing that relates to role. To work with role, we have something called as role manager. So here we have role manager, and this expects a T role inside the parameter. The default implementation of that is identity role, so we will use that right here. We will call this underscore role manager. We need to get that using dependency injection. So right here we have the role manager on identity role, and then we will say underscore role manager is equal to role manager. Now using role manager, we can create roles inside the post handler for now. We only want to create our roles one time. So after the result here, we can add an if condition, and we can first check if in the database a particular role exists or not. If it does not exist, then we can create all the roles of our application. So next time when it comes on the same statement, it will know that role already exists and it will not create that role again. So we will add a not sign and we will use the await keyword. We will use our role manager. On there we have a method role exists async. This will check if a particular role exists or not. So the role that we want to check is inside static detail, and we can check any one of the roles. So here we are checking if a kitchen role exists or not. By default it will not exist there because we have not created that role. So we can create that role using underscore role manager. We have another helper method which is create async. This expects a new identity role. Let me create that. And within the parameter here we just need to pass the role name. So the role that we want to create is kitchen role. Now since this is an async method, you can either await to make sure that it is executed before we move forward, or you can do the same thing by calling getAwaiter.getResult. That will give us the same result as await. So I just wanted to show you multiple alternatives. Now with that we will be creating not just kitchen role, but all the roles that we want in the application. So we have manager, front desk, and customer role. Once this is created, if the execution comes here again, the if condition will fail and it will not create the roles again in our application. Now the great benefit that comes with .NET Identity is you see we have lots of helper methods when we have to create a role, when we have to check if a role exists, when we have to create a user, and so on. These are all of the helper methods that .NET Core team has provided. Implementing all of this would be super time consuming, but the helper methods with role manager, user manager, sign-in manager are great functionality to build a secure application in a very efficient way. We want to retrieve the value of radio buttons, and based on that, when we register a user, we want to assign a role if any of the radio button is selected, and if none of them is selected, we will assign them customer role. So doing that is super simple. We will do that after the result is successful to create a user. So once that is successful, we can check here the role that was selected. To get the role that was selected, we can create a string of role, and we will use request.form. We will just have to type the name that we have given to our radio button. So we will get that and we will convert that to string. What that will return is if the manager role is selected, it will return the value. If kitchen role is selected, it will return the value which is constant as kitchen. So once we retrieve the value inside the role, we can check for if condition. If role is equal to st.kitchenRole, then the new user that has been created, we want to assign a role of kitchen to that user. For that we have helper methods. Inside user manager, we have add to role async. If you see the parameters in this method, first is the user object, that is what we have, and next is the string of role itself. That is inside static details, and we have the kitchen role. Inside the else condition, let me copy this if else and paste it one more time. We will check if this is a manager role. we will assign the user a role of manager. Inside else, we will paste it again to check for front desk. And if it is none of them, then by default, we will assign them the role of customer. So we will say sd.customer role. So with that, we have added logic to assign particular role to the user based on the selection in radio button. That is great. Now let's run the application and see this in action. When we try to register, we will run into an error message. Let me show you how to resolve this in the next video. When we click on the register button, we see an error message. The message says unable to resolve service type for role manager identity role while attempting to activate the register model. So what exactly is happening here is inside the register page model, where we added the dependency injection for role manager on identity role, the application is throwing exception saying that it does not know how to get an implementation of the request that we are asking here. Typically what happens is whatever we register inside program.cs in the services, it is able to provide all of that using dependency injection. Here we are using the default identity using identity user. Because of that, it does not know the use of role manager and identity role. If we want to use roles with the application, we will have to configure or modify the default identity, and we will change that to just identity, and then with identity user we will be adding a T role, which will be the default role of identity role. By default, that is not included when identity is configured in our application. So if we want to use roles, we will have to make this change from default identity to the custom identity. Once you make this change, if you run the application again, that error should be resolved. So now if you hit on register, you will see a different error. And great, we do not see the role manager error again. We do not see the error with the role manager, but we see a different error with the email sender. And the reason is still the same. If we go back to the register page model, we are using the implementation of email sender right here. When we were using the default identity, it was providing us with an implementation. When we use a custom identity right here, we need to provide an implementation of the email sender, or else it won't work. One way to make this error go away is to remove all of the email sender and its usage from this particular page. But that is not a solution. So the best thing that we can do right now is stop the application, and inside the utility project, let's implement a fake email sender. So right here, let me add a new class file, and I will call this email sender. Now this will be a public class, but this email sender should implement the email sender. If we press Ctrl dot, we will have to install the package microsoft.asp.netcore.identity.ui. When you do that, you hover on squiggly lines here and you implement the interface. It has one method, which is send email async. Here we will have to tackle sending emails, which we will cover later on in the course. Right now we can just return task.completed_task. So this is just a fake email sender. It will not actually send the email. It will just return the task is completed. If we go to our register.cs.html, now we have an implementation of email sender that can be populated. But in order to populate that with dependency injection, we will have to add that to the services of our container. Now when it comes to email, we can use a singleton implementation because only one of them is sufficient to serve our application. So we will use singleton here and add the using statements. With that, if we run the application now, all the errors will be resolved. So now if you hit register, you will not see any error message. Let's register a manager user and see what happens. So once we enter the details here, we will click the manager checkbox and hit the register button. We see one more error here, which is generate email confirmation token async. This is again one of those methods that is implemented by default with the default identity, but when we are using the custom identity, we have to register the default token generation. So right here, where we are registering the add identity with identity user and identity role, we have the add default token providers that we will have to append to our identity. We have added the default token providers, but let me show you where that is being used in the register page model. When a user is sent an email confirmation to confirm their email, we are using user manager.generate email confirmation token async. This method is not implemented if we go with the custom implementation. So we had to add that inside the program.cs with add identity. With that, let me run the application and try to register our user one more time. Let me go back to the database and see if that user was created. Then I will remove that user. In the database, if I go back and refresh, that user would be generated. Perfect, you can see that. On top of that, if you go to ASP.NET roles, our roles will also be generated. So you can see our logic is working to generate all the roles. Now we tried to register that user with the manager role. So manager roles ends in 3a. The table that maps roles and users is the user roles table. If we do select top 1000, you can see the role 3a is assigned to a user that ends in 27. So if I go to ASP.NET user, the user that ends in 27 is manager. So that means our manager user has been successfully assigned the role of manager. The error that we saw was it was trying to send an email out. That's okay if that failed. Our user was created, our roles were created, and roles were also assigned successfully. That being said, if we go back and try to log in, let me hit the login button and see what happens. You can see it redirected back here, but we did not have any errors. So I believe the reason is same that we had with the register issue. This might be fixed in future, but right now we will have to go to the login page model, and if we examine the on post, the return URL, we will have to make that a nullable field because it might be checking for model state. Whoops, not inside the get. Inside post, we will have to do that because it is checking for model state, and if there is no return URL, the model state will fail. Let's restart the application and see what happens. Let me try to log in again. And perfect, our login works. And let me register a user for customer, kitchen, and front desk. We will select front for the front at .NET Mastery. Let's register. That's great. Now let me register the kitchen user. Let's hit the register button. Let's log out. The last one is customer. For customer, we do not select anything, so it goes to the else condition and registers as the customer role. Now let me go back to the database here and inspect the ASP.NET user roles table where we have the mapping for all the 4 users. You can see we have 4 different user IDs here and all of them have different role ID. If you want to compare each one of them with user and roles, you will find out that we have the correct mapping, but I do not want to go into those details. So with this, we have created 4 users in our application with different role. Let's continue with our application from the next video.